You're listening to Big World Network.
The Warlock Invasion, Episode 1, written by Daniel Mitchell, read by Amanda Mavison. "That's right, Devlin," the fisherman said, as he made a circular motion with the point of his index finger. "Now bring it around, then back through the loop." "Like this?" the young boy asked, and when his father nodded, he brought it back through and pulled it snug. With a smile, the fisherman reached out and put a proud hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're learning quickly. One day soon you'll be able to go out on the boat with me." "Why not today?" Devlin whined. "Let Marta mend the nets." For a long moment the fisherman eyed the boy, who sat practically holding his breath and giving the most pleading look he could muster with his eyes. At long last the fisherman let out a sigh and chuckled. "All right, get your heavy cloak. There's a cold wind coming in from the east this morning." Brimming with excitement, the boy raced from the main room of the small dwelling the family was crammed into, and within moments returned wearing his thick woolen cloak and a pair of child-sized fur-lined boots. That done, the fisherman held up a finger to his mouth in a silencing gesture, and with a nod the two of them quietly made their way to the door. It was dark outside. The horizon had just begun to brighten, heralding the approach of the rising sun, and there was a damp chill in the air. The rhythmic sound of the ocean washing up onto the stony shore of the small fishing village was accompanied by the occasional cawing of a gull, and the spray from the ocean's waves had left the stones slick and somewhat treacherous. As they stepped through the door, the fisherman gazed out to the shoreline, where all of the fishermen kept their boats, immediately spotting his, along with something else that didn't belong there. His initial thought was a boat thief, his arm instinctively barring the young boy from going any further, as he herded Devlin behind him defensively. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized what he saw was no boat thief, but 4 ships of a design he'd never seen before, with a tall figure standing proudly at the head of the forefront vessel, and a crew of approximately 6 men rowing it toward the shore. Though the stranger's features were still undistinguishable, his outline left a distinct impression. What appeared to be a large horn jutted up from a piece of armor strapped to his left shoulder, while his face was concealed with a heinous-looking black leather mask. He wore a knee-length wrap around his waist, and a half-cape that hung from his right shoulder concealed his right arm. "Devlin, go inside. Now!" the fisherman said, raising his voice before the boy could utter a word of protest. Frightened by the urgency of his father's voice, Devlin scurried back inside. Once he was in, the fisherman pushed the door shut tightly and leaned in close so that Devlin could hear him inside. "Bar the door from the inside. Don't ask questions," he said, and when he heard the wooden plank slide into place, he turned back around. It was as he reached the shore that the men had begun to disembark from their vessel, the one he'd seen standing at the forefront stepping out first. Yet when the sound of feet crashing through water did not come next, the fisherman looked down and reeled back at what he saw. Feet clad in leather sandals that wound up to mid-calf length, treading across the surface of the water, as if it were solid ground. The fisherman blinked his eyes as he stared up at the stranger incredulously, before looking back down to verify he wasn't simply levitating. But as the pre-dawn light continued to grow, it became clear that the stranger's footsteps did indeed fall upon the water's surface, and the horror of the realization sent the fisherman staggering backwards. Upon reaching the stony shore, the stranger transitioned from water to solid ground effortlessly, the others from his boat slogging through the ankle-deep waves behind him. As he came to a halt, he turned his attention to the fisherman from behind the mask he wore. Lined with the teeth from a beast the fisherman couldn't identify, it had but a single opening for the right eye, the place where a left eye would have peered through, patched over, and crossed out with red slash marks. A small slit for a mouth was stitched almost completely shut, leaving just enough of a gap for thin lips to be visible. A crimson-red eye that seemed to glow dimly in the faint light of dawn stared down at the fisherman, and he held the distinct impression that he'd been judged and found unworthy. The fisherman breathed heavily for several moments, unsure of whether to flee or stay put, when the horn-armored man addressed him in a language he didn't understand, and an accent he'd never heard. His voice had an unnerving quality to it, and his tone was one the fisherman often used when forcing the truth out of Devlin when the boy had misbehaved. "What? I can't understand you," the fisherman replied, shaking his head frantically as if to emphasize his point. In response, the horn-armored man let out a frustrated-sounding sigh as he leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Reaching up, he carefully lifted the mask from his face, and as he did, the 6 others that were with him immediately fell to one knee. As the fisherman continued to observe him, he spotted the sinister-looking tattoos that ran up and down the man's arm, when the half-cape made of an unrecognizable purple leather fell aside, as well as the ones around the man's throat and neck. When the stranger lowered his head again, his face was that of a man, a narrow nose with high cheekbones and a gaunt appearance. His skin was an unnatural ashen color, and as the fisherman watched, an intricate series of blue veins coursed across his face like a dam that had burst. As the blue veins branched throughout his complexion, his skin turned from an ashen gray to a ghastly-looking white, and his vibrant red irises glassed over in a sheen of white, while an abyssal-sounding voice came from the very mouth that had addressed the fisherman a moment ago. Deep, guttural, and foreboding, as he spoke, the horn-armored man's forked tongue flicked over his teeth. "You speak the common tongue of the Western Kingdoms, I presume." A chill ran up the fisherman's spine, causing him to shiver uncontrollably. Any inclination to run had been replaced with a cold fear that froze him in place. Despite being in the midst of the summer season, the very air around him grew bitingly cold, allowing him to see each and every one of his panicked breaths. When he tried to speak, he could not find his voice, and was only able to nod feebly. The horn-armored man tilted his head slowly. "Name the god to whom you pray." Nearly choking on his words, the fisherman closed his eyes a moment to try to gather his courage, yet still the image of the horn-armored man haunted his thoughts. When he reopened his eyes, he found the horn-armored man still staring at him unblinking, awaiting his response. "Othran, we pray to him for a bountiful catch." "And Othran hears your prayers," the horn-armored man continued, his pale white face of an intrigued expression. Some days more than others," the fisherman stammered, and silently cursed himself for not staying indoors with his family. "Is Othran your only god?" the man asked, and when the fisherman shook his head, the man smiled. "Name them." I can't name them all." "Do the best you can," the man said, his expression hardening as he began to grow impatient. And so the fisherman spoke of Aormic the Benevolent One, who taught above all things charity and kindness to others, particularly beggars; of Brago the Titan, who more than anything else valued strength, athleticism, and battle prowess; of Iskana the Huntress, the patron deity of the journeyman, who instructed her followers to preserve the balance of nature through harmonious living and a keen aim with a longbow. But it was when he spoke of Mythos the All-Father that the man's interest piqued. His eyebrows furrowed intently, and he crouched down to see eye to eye with the fisherman. "And this All-Father, his following is the largest, you say?" "Generally speaking," the fisherman replied, still terrified, but beginning to hope he may yet survive the encounter. "His champion has done a great deal for the good of the realm, and his cathedral in the holy city of Ascension is the largest of any others." "The All-Father has a champion, does he?" the man asked, and smiled wickedly. Yes, the cleansing light." The stranger inhaled deeply, and when he exhaled, an unnatural-sounding growl accompanied it. "You have been most useful. Tell me, what is your name?" Benson. My name is Benson." With a smile, the stranger nodded, and Benson felt the exhilaration of being free and clear of what could have potentially been a dangerous situation. But then the horn-armored man slowly reached out, cradled Benson's neck in his left hand, and placed his right hand on Benson's chest. That done, the stranger closed his eyes in concentration, and with great effort tugged his hand away from Benson's chest. As he did, Benson felt a freezing cold sensation at the tips of his fingers and toes, and the further the stranger pulled his hand away, the more the sensation spread up his limbs until it consumed his entire body. With a sharp snap like the breaking of a thick cord of rope, a weightless sensation overcame Benson as he looked down in horror at his own lifeless body, the disconnect of his conscious being from his physical remains causing sheer and utter panic in him. Helplessly he watched as the horn-armored man let his limp, blue body slump to the ground. And in that same instant, Benson realized that he was aware of everything around him all at once, and his vision no longer limited to a pair of eyes. It was thus that he also came to realize the very life essence that comprised him was being held firmly in the palm of the stranger's hand, until he made a snuffing gesture and clenched it tightly into a fist. Then came the fall, as an inescapable blackness surrounded Benson, and the cold of the afterlife was replaced with an intense burning heat that licked hungrily at him like a ravenous animal. As his destination came into view, he spotted them, thousands upon thousands, if not millions, each with humanoid traits that only lent to their dreadful, grotesque appearances. Some walked on a pair of legs, while others skittered about on sets of arachnid-like sets of 8, while still others soared the skies with leathery bat-like wings and a pair of sinister talons for feet. So varying in horrific appearances were they that he could have spent a lifetime among them and never witnessed them all. When the awful realization dawned on him, he would never escape this plane of torment. As complete and utter despair overcame him, he let out the bone-chilling moan only a damned soul is capable of, while the cacophonous laughter of the demonic horde, greeting their newest victim, surrounded him. Rising from his crouched position, the horn-armored man leaned his head back again, and after another long moment of pause, when he looked back down, his eyes had returned to their sinister red, his ashen complexion returning as well, to drive out the sickly blue veins. "What of the village, Lord Jowrock?" one of the others asked in their native tongue, at which point Jowrock calmly put the hideous leather mask back on. As he did, they rose from their kneeling positions and stood at attention as he addressed them, in the voice that could make a grown man's skin crawl. "They will make fine offerings to the horde, tear down their homes for firewood. The others are arriving, and we'll be setting up camp here for the time. being." "Understood," the others said in unison, and immediately set about their task. Soon the sound of ravaged screams as men, women, children, and elderly alike were dragged from their homes and given as sacrifice filled the air, while Jowrock let out a contented sigh and swayed his head to the sounds as though they were music. When the sun crested the horizon and illuminated the ocean before him, he opened his eyes again and peered out at the gentle waves before him. There, not far off in the distance, more than 100 ships slowly rowed their way toward the shore, each one bearing the plain ash-gray sails of his fleet, with a full rowing crew. "Mythos, the All-Father," Jowrock said quietly to himself. "I look forward to meeting your champion." Standing outside the training ring with his arms folded across his chest, Vlishkanath narrowed his eyes. As he reached up to rub his chin, he smoothed out the neatly trimmed full beard that adorned his face in equal parts of black and gray, complete with a connecting mustache. His hair, no longer the flowing mane of raven-black waves, had been cropped short for quite some time, with intermingling grays and even a few stray whites to match the beard on his face. "Both hands on the grip," he called out. "It isn't a long sword. One hand isn't going to do you any good." "It works for him," the blonde-haired youth called out. Standing a full 2 heads taller than Vlishkanath, and considerably larger, despite having just come of anointing age, the vibrantly blue-eyed young trainee had the size and strength of a man grown, his muscled broad shoulders and imposing frame granting him the ability to deftly wield the 2-handed weapon with a natural ease. Yet he still looked downright diminutive compared to his sparring partner. Clad in his terror-inspiring black steel plate mail, the half-giant Sir Maximus the Dread Knight's Bane wore judgment at his back. Gripped firmly in his hands was an oversized, blunted greatsword, sized specifically for Maximus, and constructed so that he could train the boy. "Yes, but you're not him," Vlishkanath replied sternly. "Keep both hands on your sword like he's showing you." "Listen to what he says," Maximus barked, and as he did, he launched another series of carefully aimed swings that put the boy on the defensive. Hurriedly taking the grip of his own weapon in both hands, with each successive swing the boy managed to carefully deflect Maximus's blows away. As his efforts continued to be successful, he let out a boisterous laugh. "Why are we wasting time on fundamentals, Maximus? Show me something I don't already know." With a snarling grunt, as their blades clashed again, Maximus spun the youth's blade around and drove it into the ground, keeping it pinned there as he stepped forward and gently pushed his shoulder into the boy. Losing his footing, the boy staggered backwards and abandoned his grip on his sword to catch himself from falling to the ground. As he landed on his backside, he let out another laugh. "That wasn't exactly new, but I have to admit I wasn't ready for it." "You're never too good to brush up on the basics," Maximus said, as he offered an enormous hand down to help the boy up. "Don't ever forget that." "Sloppy," came another voice, as a brown-eyed young man, clad in a simple navy blue tabard belted around his waist, with a long-sleeved white shirt and white leggings underneath, approached the ring. As he came to stand next to Vlishkinath, he folded his arms across his chest in much the same manner, and save the difference in age, height, and eye color, one might swear they were looking at a younger, leaner Vlishkinath. "Any time you'd care to show us all how it's done, brother," the blond-haired young man offered, as he reached over and held out the grip of the greatsword with a grin. "I wouldn't need that," the black-haired youth replied, at which point Vlishkinath turned his attention to him. "Why are you here, Grom?" "Mother sent me outside." "Why did she send you outside?" Vlishkinath asked, as his eyes narrowed suspiciously. "No reason," Graham replied, as he continued to watch Brahm stand up and dust himself off. "I don't believe you," Vlishkinath stated, and when Grom saw the way his father frowned at him, he laughed lightly. "She still doesn't approve of my smoking." "You know it bothers her. Why do you insist upon it indoors?" Vlishkinath chided, and as he did, he turned to face Grom fully. "I don't," Grom answered defensively. "I do it without thinking about it. Besides, I'm not nearly as bad as Loremaster Garadane." With a heavy sigh, Vlishkinath turned back around to face Brahm and Maximus in the training yard. "Why have you stopped?" With a crooked grin, Brahm shrugged his massive shoulders. "This was more amusing." Vlishkinath blinked, then looked to Maximus. "Run him through some unarmed tactics, Max," Vlishkinath said plainly, upon which the grin immediately melted from Brahm's face as his eyes grew wide in terror. "No, Maximus, don't!" Brahm cried out, holding his hands up defensively. But the half-giant had already dropped his blunted training greatsword and advanced upon the blond youth with his gigantic hands outstretched. The moment he made contact with Brahm, his fingers closed around him, and he began contorting the strapping young man into various holds and arm locks designed for larger combatants to utilize their strength and size. "At least he's enjoying himself," Graham said, and when Vlishkinath fought to stifle a snicker, Graham couldn't help but chuckle as well. "Did she happen to say anything else as she was sending you outside?" Vlishkinath asked, as they watched Brahm try to concede victory by tapping out before Maximus grabbed hold of his tapping arm and twisted it around behind him. "I think she may have shouted something at me about inviting Maximus for dinner again," Grom replied. With a nod, Vlishkinath looked up at the sun as it began to sink behind the walls of the training yard, and after another moment called out, "All right, that's enough for today. Let him up, Max." For several seconds longer, Maximus held Brahm in place, until finally he begrudgingly let go. Pushing himself off the ground, Maximus turned and looked down at Brahm, who laid on the ground with his arms out at his sides and his legs spread apart, panting heavily and staring glassy-eyed up into the sky. "Get up. It didn't hurt that bad." "How would you know?" Brahm said, and when he grinned, Maximus reached down to help him up again. Once he was up, Brahm gave him a hard shove, and while it didn't have his desired effect, he managed what none of the others could claim. It caused the half-giant to sway ever so slightly. While Brahm brushed himself off yet again, Vlishkinath called out, "Are you hungry, Max?" "Are you cooking?" Maximus asked in response. Vlishkinath rolled his eyes and shook his head. "Let's go. Brahm, tidy up the training yard and we'll see you at home." "Yes, sir," Brahm answered, in a tone of militant respect. As Maximus approached, Vlishkinath turned and the three of them began making their way through the yard, while Graham produced a long-stemmed wooden pipe and began to pack it full from a brown leather bag. "Really?" Vlishkinath asked, giving him a slightly disapproving look. I may as well get one more in before we get home, Graham answered, as he stuffed the brown leather bag back into one of his belt pouches.
You're listening to Big World Network.